Jonathan Briskman, Sensor Tower's marketing insight guru in the house. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Again, longtime fan of everything you've been doing. So really excited to be on and thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And you know what? Let's just jump right in because you released a big state of the market report, and there's plenty of questions to ask. But I think we should just start off with, if you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify, there's going to be tons of graphs here. But let's start off with like what's going on mobile, like overall. Where are we right now? What's happening?
As you mentioned, we released our State of Mobile report. It is quite large. I believe like over 95 pages of content covering everything mobile, from gaming to social media to fintech. So a lot of stuff in there, and I encourage anyone to go check it out. But yeah, just starting at a high level, I'd say that the mobile landscape is kind of starting to take shape after several turbulent years. We had the pandemic, and then a market correction following the pandemic, and we're kind of starting to see what the mobile market's going to look like moving forward. And overall, I'd say it's looking really strong. Again, if you are able to see on the screen, you can see some of these metrics here. I'm also
Hmm.
going to try to shout them out for the podcast
Yeah.
listeners as well. Um, but we're looking at, downloads are roughly flat at around, they're 136 billion this year. That's where they've been hovering the last several years, between 135 and 140 billion. A lot of people have the apps they need for the most part, and then they're just kind of getting the new ones as they come out. So we're kind of seeing that rate, staying pretty steady. Then if we're looking at some of these other metrics, time spent, up a healthy 6% year over year. So that's a really good sign. People can still continuing to spend more and more time on their mobile devices. Although I do want to note that that's actually not true in every market. So in some markets, we are actually starting to see it level out a bit. And I think we'll get into that more as we go on. And then finally, looking at in-app purchase revenue, which obviously a big metric for people. That's how much people are paying for their in-app purchases, subscriptions, also paid apps and games, is 150 billion for 2024, up 12.5% year over year. So really strong growth there. This is across apps and games. So
Yeah.
everything combined here. But yeah, I'd say overall as we're entering 2025. The market looks really strong, and we're seeing good growth across pretty much all industries right now.
Yeah. Double-digit growth of revenue in that purchase alone is pretty spectacular. I don't know about growth. More time spent on devices always sounds crazier, and not healthy. You you said healthy. I'm like, this is not healthy. We're spending too much time as it is. But the interesting part here is the new app downloads. Like it's pretty much the same as last year. Would would you categorize this market as mature right now? It's definitely not declining, but it is mature, right?
Attention app and game developers, are you ready to unlock the secrets behind the world's top performing apps and games? With Sensor Tower, you get the ultimate competitive edge, whether it's breaking into new markets, fine-tuning your UA strategies, or boosting monetization. Dive into data like never before, track global trends across app stores, analyze market-leading in-app purchase and in-app ad strategies, and benchmark your performance with real-time insight. The best part, Sensor Tower doesn't just deliver data, it helps you turn it into action. With intuitive tools and expert analysis, it's everything you need to make smarter, faster decisions. Thousands of app and game studios, from indie creators to global giants, trust Sensor Tower to help them win. So why not you? Start your free trial today at sensortower.com. That is sensortower.com.
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, so like if we're thinking about markets like, the more established markets like the United States, we've seen downloads decline. That's not a new thing. It's actually, actually even leading into the pandemic, they basically flattened out. So we are starting to see those kind of forces spread across the rest of the globe as as their mobile adoption, smartphone usage, that kind of thing catches up. So I'd say that's just kind of a consistent factor we're seeing here. I will also note that downloads are still well up from where they were in 2019. Again, I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail, but we're talking about that huge surge in 2020 around the pandemic. So downloads were they spiked during that time. And so even though they're down a little bit year over year, and from that peak we saw in 2020 and 2021, they're still way higher than they were in 2019. So I think this is kind of where we're starting to see the market settle a little bit.
Got it. Okay. So more time on devices, more money spent, but not per se more apps. I think what will be interesting is talk about more about mobile gaming, actually, since that's the most of our audience. And I'm just going to open up another graph you had here, and this is on mobile gaming and mobile game download. So in terms of mobile game in-app purchase revenue growth, we're seeing minor growth, very, very minor. Like we're talking about 4%. That's pretty much on par with inflation at the moment. And in terms of download growth, I think we shouldn't be even talking about download growth. We should be talking about download decline. So is mobile gaming the one that is kind of bringing down the overall app downloads down?
Game devs. We know that great gameplay is what players love, but integrating metagame features like challenges, progression, rewards is crucial for retention and monetization. However, coding them is a tedious and time-consuming process. That's why top studios have turned to Hero. Hero provides a complete suite of battle-tested metagame features that are quick to implement, letting you spend more time on the core gameplay experience. Ready to ship fully featured, engaging games? Check out Hero today by clicking the link below.
As you mentioned, we're looking at 81 billion in revenue, in-app purchase revenue for the mobile gaming side of things, which is up, as you mentioned, 4% year over year. This is, I think, a good thing that it's a bounce back from back-to-back years of declines that we saw in 2021. But it does lag. For example, non-gaming saw 25% year-over-year growth last year in in-app purchase revenue. The gaming still takes the lion's share. It's still more than half of the total in-app purchase revenue on mobile, but the gap is closing pretty quickly. So I think, we would not be surprised to see, non-gaming catch up over the next couple of years in terms of that total revenue between gaming and non-gaming. And then, you mentioned downloads down 6% year over year to just under 50 billion globally. I think, again, there's a lot of factors at play here, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of them in more detail as we're discussing. We saw a lot of challenges in 2021 and 2022 that, caused that decline. I think there's the well-discussed topics like the deprecation of IDFA that made it more challenging for mobile gaming companies to find the right user base, the right audience. We also had, things like the release of web, or the more prominent use of web stores. So I do want to note this, again, all only includes iOS and Google Play. So to be honest, you mentioned 4% year over year, roughly the same as inflation. We're a little bit more optimistic about the global market, the mobile gaming market globally, just because, this doesn't necessarily capture all of the revenue, and we're seeing maybe a little bit more of a share going to those web stores over time. But then I think finally, again, the third thing that may be a little bit of an underestimated factor, especially because we saw it impact the non-gaming side as well, is just the correction from the pandemic. The mobile gaming market was doing so well, was seeing such rapid growth in 2020 and 2021. I think we were due for just a little bit of a correction. I mean, even just putting it into perspective, I think, we were seeing things like 25% year over year growth in revenue in 2020, and then another 10% in 2021. So a lot of what we're seeing here, even though, year over year, these numbers, look a little bit modest, I think if we are able to take a step back and take a little bit of a longer term view, looking, pre-pandemic and trying to forecast what we'd expect going forward, from my perspective, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic that we're going to see, growth return maybe more in the 5 to 10% range next year is what I'd be hoping for.
Okay, so you're saying that in-app purchase growth will accelerate going forward, but what caused it to grow even now 4% compared to the decline before?
Several factors, and some of the ones are honestly, based on what caused the declines in the first place. So one, just being the market correcting, I think that's going to naturally boost things back up again after those down years. I also think it just took developers naturally. It makes sense. It took them a couple of years to figure out how to operate in this new world. And so we're starting to see them find out ways to do that and find success. I'm sure we'll get into some specific examples in just a little bit. So I think that's a driver too. I mean, honestly, and I think, some of the challenges are also a little bit more local. So for example, like Japan's a market where we're seeing declines, partially just due to economic factors in the region. And also because, we measure things in US dollars. So a weaker currency means that, the revenue on our platform is going to look lower. And so, yeah, I mean, I think even at the end of 2024, we were starting to see Japan turn the corner and get positive growth again. And so that could actually have a decent boosting effect on the rest of the world. If we exclude China, Japan, and Korea, in-app purchase revenue actually climbed 9% year over year. So again, a lot of the challenges tended to be a little bit more regional, and we're already seeing the market kind of bounce back across a lot of the rest of the globe, like Europe, America, as publishers adjust to kind of this new environment we're looking at here.
That's fascinating. I didn't take into that account. So if you say if we exclude China and Japan, two key Asian markets, then the in-app purchase growth would be at 9%.
Yep, correct. So yeah, again, it looks a lot better if you exclude some of those key markets.
Yeah.
Of course, those are huge markets, so those are very important to follow.
Yeah, but they're also closed markets, like Japan, Korea, China, all extremely affluent markets. I mean, China is probably the size of the U.S. in terms of market revenue, maybe even larger, who knows? But there's no access for Western developers, so it's kind of pointless to looking at those markets.
True, and I do think honestly, it actually reminds me that there's probably another thing we can look at here I think that would be interesting for game developers is a lot of the decline we saw in something that was pulling down the average in 2024 was also pretty specific to RPGs, which again are more popular in some of those APAC markets. And so, if we took out RPGs, you're looking at more like other genres like strategy, action, puzzle, casino, things like that. Again, I think we'd be seeing much more healthy growth across the board. So overall, that's another reason I'm optimistic for the market moving forward is that it does seem like some of the declines were pretty limited to certain areas. And I think those will start to level out. And those were definitely pulling down the overall average in 2024.
Well, that's a super positive message. Well, talking about positive messages, the other one is that I like to look at, and you have in your report, you have the number of apps surpassing 10 million, surpassing 100 million, surpassing 1 billion. Perhaps those are left for very few. But even looking at apps that are making 10 million or more, I think that's sustainable business for many startups. So that's kind of like a metric of healthiness of the market. And when we're looking at this graph, it shows that the amount of apps that are making over 10 million in annual in-app purchase revenues is steadily increasing, and actually increased quite significantly in 2024. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Step into the future of game monetization with Xsolla, the premier partner for game developers seeking to expand their reach and revenue. Xsolla provides a robust suite of tools designed to enhance user acquisition, manage subscriptions, and streamline payment solutions worldwide. Unlock new markets and maximize profitability through their customized, secure payment architecture and dedicated support team. Xsolla, powering game developers to achieve global success.
Sure. Again, I think the game non-game split is pretty interesting here. So a lot of the growth we've been seeing in terms of making the 10 million, $100 million barriers is coming from non-games. Even just thinking of things like AI, all these AI chatbot apps and things like that entering the market is really help boosting this. But again, it's something we're seeing across the non-gaming space as I think their monetization kind of catches up. Gaming got off to a huge start and was, way more sophisticated early on in monetization on mobile. And we're just seeing non-gaming, I think, kind of close that gap a little bit and have been for, I guess, most of the past decade. So yeah, I mean, I think it's, that's explaining a lot of the growth overall. If we look at games in particular, you'll see it's pretty much just like, for example, with the $10 million plus, it's pretty much just leveled out at, between 800 and 900 games reaching the threshold each year. And again, I just think that has to do with a lot of the other market forces we were talking about, where, it's still very possible for these games to reach these thresholds. It's just become a little bit more challenging in this environment. Another thing that I do want to point out too that we've been noticing, and we just go into a little bit more detail in the report, is it's gotten a little bit harder for new games to enter the market. So again, with some of these, the changes to the privacy changes and things like that, it has been more challenging for new games. So that's another trend we've been noticing. Again, far from impossible. We'll talk about, as you can see on the screen here, there's some really, really good recent launches that are even reaching $1 billion. So it's very possible to break through. But we are seeing, it's more challenging than it was even 5 years ago for new games to, reach the top 1,000 by revenue or by downloads in the year that they launch.
Yeah, in the graph, it's showing games that reach 1 billion in annual global in purchase revenue for the first time. In 2024, we got Dungeon and Fighter. So this is game out of China, in China. We got the Whiteout Survival and Last War. I think they were both launched in 2023.
Yep, that's correct.
2020. Yeah. So again, 2 games out of China with extremely misleading ads and incredibly aggressive monetization tactics. And we got Brawl Stars crossing 1 billion mark. That game was released in 2018. So it took that game quite a hot minute to get over 1 billion. Supercell usually cross this line faster, but Brawl Stars kicked in the heavy gear for live ops.
Seriously. I mean, I think we can maybe go into these one by one. So starting with, you mentioned Last War, Whiteout Survival, I think pretty similar strategies overall. Last War, for example, they had faster revenue growth than any other mobile game in 2024. So, more revenue growth than Monopoly Go, more than Dungeon and Fighter. So just kind of incredible success. It ranked even number 5 in total revenue, like among games in 2024. So ahead of Candy Crush even. So again, just phenomenally successful year for Last War. Again, I guess you have to be to reach $1 billion for the first time.
Have you played that game?
I didn't, but I have seen the ads, so yeah. I got a little bit of an experience on it.
I'm also not installed. I'm looking at it as not a spyware, but something that is going to deplete my bank account. Almost like a virus, so I'm not going to even touch it. Just FYI,
Yeah, it's funny. It's like that. I feel like it reminds me almost of like a TikTok in terms of it's like, oh, I'm almost like this will get me too hooked. It's like it's like if you download it, I can't I'm gonna start watching videos for 3 hours. So it's like exactly. I need to not let myself even just get started.
Exactly, nothing malicious. I know my friend has spent a car's worth on that money, so I'm like, I'm good. I'm not gonna install that one.
Yeah. Yep. So then talking about how they were able to do this, I think one thing is that they had their UA strategy in mind when they were developing the game. I mean, again, you're talking about the ads, really simple gameplay that you can even have in the background of TikToks and things like that. So you can kind of get it to go a little bit viral that way, where people are being exposed to the game, especially for a strategy game. It looks simple. It's a lot easier for people to pick up and start playing. But then you also mentioned it's got kind of those more, it's, what we are classifying as these hybrid casual, same with Whiteout Survival, where you use that kind of mix of almost like hyper casual style, a little bit ad monetization combined with some mid-core elements to kind of improve engagement, keep people playing, and then, monetize through the in-app purchases as well. I think these are obviously two of the biggest examples of the hybrid casual success, kind of using those strategies.
Do you categorize these games as hybrid casual? I mean, the way I see it, there's nothing hybrid casual in them other than the fake ads and fake mini game. Other than that, it's a typical Forex game.
Yeah, for us, it has to do, I think, with a lot of it's just, their monetization strategy. So It's the combination of, using the ad monetization with kind of that in-app purchase revenue as well. And so I don't know for sure if they still both. I know Whiteout Survive. One of them may have actually removed ads and no longer monetizes that way. But I believe they
Exactly.
both started out that way. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
possible. I'll have to check. We might not classify them both as hybrid casual
Yeah.
anymore, but I believe they
I
both
would
kind of started that way.
I would really doubt it because these games are they're big games, even though they look cheap. And secondly, I don't think they make significant portion of their revenue through ads because they rely quite heavily on retention and engagement. And the more ads you show to a retained player, the less value there is from that. And of course, they monetize through all the competitive settings. So anyway, details. Let's move on. Sorry for
No, no worries. No, it's helpful. So I mean, I think those are two kind of similar use cases talking about Last War and Whiteout Survival. Dungeon Fighter, as you obviously mentioned, that's a pretty special case, just relying on already having a huge audience in China specifically, released by Tencent. So going to be successful there. And then I think Brawl Stars is maybe the most interesting case from what we're looking at because you mentioned it's been a title that's been around for a while, and we kind of just saw it just take off in 2024, seemingly out of nowhere. And I think this reflects again kind of what we were talking about, where publishers are starting to, game developers are figuring out how to operate in this new system. So one thing that we found some of these established, developers doing is focusing more on their existing titles than trying to launch new games. Again, we mentioned how it's more challenging for new games to succeed in this environment. So it's not true with, just Supercell's games. We're seeing it with a lot of other, games that have been around forever, like your Candy Crush, Roblox, things like that, that are doing really, really well. And I think a lot of it does have to do with just focus from the publisher. So, Supercell was focusing on its existing titles and, isn't even, it ended its soft launch games, got rid of those. So it's not even thinking about them anymore and is, focusing on games like Brawl Stars and also focused on, live ops, things like that, events across the globe, making sure things are, localized so it can find success across the globe, including, both Eastern and Western markets. And so I think that was one of the ways that it was really able to find success this year that I think we're seeing a lot of other publishers do.
mentioning that they also focused on performance marketing for the first time. So
Yes,
I think
true.
before that, I think that's the major driver of revenue. Of course, the live ops need to be there, but they have been, live for a very long time. But it seems like when you look at the download curve, that's what really shot up during the 2024. So I think that, influx of new users in tens of millions kind of helps as well.
For sure. And I think another thing that we're going to see across the globe, I mean, and I think with most, with again, Dungeon Fighter, I feel like as the exception here, is that a lot of the games that we're finding to be successful now are also kind of broadly appealing. So they are able, like you mentioned, they're able to, it's like, okay, we want to focus on, these certain markets. We can go in Europe and APAC and, the US, and it's going to work across all those places. Of course, you might need different strategies in each of those places, but the game's going to have appeal in each of those markets. And that's another thing that's consistent with, the three of those four, the one that's only in China is the exception, is that they are all three of those games are successful in the US, in some of the top markets in Asia and in Europe, and even markets like the Middle East. I think Saudi Arabia ranks as a top 10 market for a lot of these games as well. So we're seeing the U.S., Korea, Japan, Germany, Saudi Arabia. It's just they're very much a global appeal, and I think that's another way that game developers can kind of think about how to, if you're going to try to make $1 billion game, you do have to be successful everywhere. And it also does help insulate you from that risk we were talking about earlier, where some markets might be declining. You're able to weather that better if you appeal across the globe.
Yeah, put some effort in key markets. That will be probably the way to move it. Like not every market is as important. Naturally, different games have different affinity in different markets. But if you have good traction in Saudi Arabia, let's say, for example, or overall in the Gulf states, maybe you should focus on that. Maybe you should set up operations, even in minimal format, country managers and so forth, to double down on that. That's probably what's going to be happening with many companies in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And again, of course, it's easier said than done. You have to know you have to know the markets, know the regions. It does take work, but again, with these, we're talking $1 billion games. They have been able to do that.
Yeah. Anything else you can take out of the trends? Like, we're definitely kind of looking at the top games, and I mean, there's apps. 2022, Google won. Last year, there was Wii TV, so Chinese apps coming in. There seems to be more and more Chinese game. If you start, kind of zooming out, there's Honor of Kings came before, but this is zooming out and looking at the market as a whole. It's Western games, it's Chinese, and it's Japanese. That's where you can kind of see them here.
Yep. Yeah. And just looking, I mean, these are, again, just because it's hard to reach $1 billion. It's, it's going to be a relatively small population we're looking at here, but I'd say that's generally true. I think we will see more non-games enter this as well. So we'll see that continue to happen. It's actually kind of interesting, I think, that we've only seen one non-game do it in the past 2 years, while over the same period, we've seen 6 games. I do want to also call out, again, nothing news breaking here, but another way to really find success on mobile is even just looking back to last year, Monopoly Go, because I don't want to undercount that, how successful of a launch that was. It even dragged up the total average for the new releases. It looked like new releases actually had a great year last year, and a lot of that was just Monopoly Go. So again, the power of having a strong IP can still break through today. I mean, I think so. Some of the other successes is if we're looking for how do you thinking about Pokemon, TCG Pocket, things like that. If you can successfully launch a game with that powerful IP, that can be another way to help you break through.
Yeah. For a long time, I didn't think I would hear that for mobile, that you'd be using outside IP, because for the longest time we didn't. We came up with our own IPs, but now it's back to the basics. Get a big, globally, favored IP, build a proven monetization engine behind that, and you're good to go.
Yeah, totally. And again, it's, maybe a little bit of a simpler strategy, but also more expensive. Yeah.
Exactly. And of course, multi-$100 million marketing budgets behind it and so forth. So there's that. But yeah, it's what goes into a mature market. One thing that I found really interesting. So I don't know if this was in this presentation or was it in my own. This looks like my own deck that I've thankfully gotten from Sensor Tower. So this one is just for the listeners. It's game in-app purchase revenue share on App Store and how it has evolved over time. So it goes between 2017 to 2024 on looking at the mobile gaming in-app purchase revenues, and then the graph looks at the portion of app and game revenue. And on App Store alone, it looks like apps are now generating more than 50% of all the in-app purchase revenues. Can you talk about this trend? Because looking at last couple of years, apps are the ones that are driving the revenue.
Yeah. So this is really interesting, and very glad to see you using our data like this. It's, finding super interesting trends. I actually noticed, I saw this on one of the prediction pieces, I believe, on your site the other day. I think there's several factors here, and some of it may not concern gaming as much. Some may, in terms of competition from non-gaming. I think one of the drivers is just that, again, apps were kind of behind in terms of monetization. For a while, they were just focusing on subscription model. So we can bring up TikTok as an example. So TikTok had $6 billion in consumer spend on mobile last year. And you're shaking your head. I mean, no other app or game even reached 3 billion. So it was more than double the next competitor. So it's just, wild numbers here. And it monetizes primarily through just, these one-time in-app purchases to buy coins to tip creators. And, of course, TikTok only gets, a cut of that. The creator also gets a share of that too. So, in terms of total revenue for the company, it's not going to be that 6 billion, figure, but still we're talking about huge amounts of money from this monetization strategy that no one had even thought of, probably as 5-7 years ago. By comparison, TikTok was only making $180,000 a year from in-app purchases in 2019. So just 5 years ago, it went from 180,000 to To 6 billion. So yeah, pretty wild growth there. And it's an entirely new strategy for non-gaming. Before that, they almost entirely used the subscription model. So I think that's one of the areas we're seeing a lot of growth is just non-gaming kind of catching up with their strategies. And then I think another factor too is just people, the broader population, becoming more comfortable paying for things on their phones. So I do want to call out that I think a portion of this too might just be people paying for their streaming service, their Netflix, paying for YouTube Premium, things like that on their mobile devices, rather than going through webs. So doing it on the computer, meaning we wouldn't be capturing that revenue here. So I think that's part of it too, is that we're just capturing a larger share of app spending than we used to be. So that's another factor that may be a little bit less concerning to games because, people are still spending the money. It's just going through their mobile phone rather than on the web. In terms of what lessons I think games can learn, because I think that's kind of an interesting question here too. I think one thing that non-games have been doing is diversifying their strategies a lot more. And obviously this is something games have been doing for a while. But again, it used to be almost entirely the subscription. So every single top non-game just used the subscription model and that was it. And then, TikTok kind of, I think, got everyone out of that mindset by showing that you could succeed in another way. And so we're seeing other ways to do it. Of course, a lot of these apps also monetize through ads. So, you've got the big social networks, but, now you have Meta's apps like Instagram adding Instagram badges to try to compete with TikTok's, coins, or you have Snapchat adding a subscription, whereas it used to only monetize through ads. But even in things like the dating space, if we look at Hinge dating app, it was a subscription focused app. And then it started adding like these bundles of roses. So these one-time in-app purchases that you could buy as an added benefit. And that really helped boost its revenue. And also I think, another benefit for these apps is that it does diversify their strategy a bit, which does make them a little bit more insulated for, the ups and downs of the markets across, maybe people are getting tired of subscription fatigue and they don't want to pay for as many subscriptions. Having a boost from those one-time purchases can help as well. So again, I know it's a pretty broad strategy, but it is something that we are seeing on the non-gaming side.
This podcast is brought to you by AppsFlyer. In today's digital world, understanding your app's journey from discovery to download is more than just insightful, it's essential. Enter AppsFlyer, the leader in mobile attribution and marketing analytics that allows you to measure the full potential of your marketing efforts, making every ad dollar work smarter. With AppsFlyer, that's your new reality. Dive deep into data-driven insights that reveal exactly where your users come from and how they'll interact with your app. AppsFlyer, where your app's potential meets performance.
So you're diversifying your revenue model, and unlike games, they didn't diversify their revenue model by trying to monetize the non-payers with endless stream of ads.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think, with, again, like the deprecation of IDFA and the challenges in advertising across gaming and non-gaming. I think it was true for the social companies as well that, monetized a lot through ads. It just showed that by being totally reliant on one monetization method made you a little bit more vulnerable to, huge market forces like that. I think there's possibility for these for game developers, app developers to become more creative with these ideas. Just because, again, it's with TikTok as an example, I think it just kind of, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, if that was going to be that successful, I would have said it was impossible. So I think, there certainly are probably areas of opportunity for someone who is creative enough to explore it.
When I look at the graph on the right, so not per se, I have two graphs here, just showing that the revenue from games has been even because the revenue in Asia have been declining versus, U.S. and other markets has grown a little bit, and that evens out to zero growth. But when we look at the app revenue growing, as you said, a lot of it is diversification of business model, and the diversification comes through in-app purchase, and in-app purchases are coming through adding new features, new elements, gamifying the apps. Have you, as a market guru, how much have you been hearing about the gamification part?
Yeah, it's actually it's an interesting one because I'd say it's been more on like a case by case basis. It's like almost like seeing it at a case study level. It's something that we're seeing several apps do, but it's not like completely widespread yet. I'm thinking of an example is like Duolingo. I think is probably a good example where gamification, also AI. I mean, they recently added some new really interesting AI features like the ability to you have like actually like almost like a FaceTime, like a call with one of their cartoon characters, and you can converse in the language with the character. So yeah, again, really interesting stuff they're doing. But they also do have like a game, a game like kind of almost like progression thing that you can do with that higher tier subscription. So again, it's something we're seeing with I think some of the most innovative players on the non gaming side, where they're starting to explore the gamification of their apps. And again, then you get higher engagement, you get higher retention. Duolingo is so popular. You have people who are paying money to fix their streaks, because they want to make sure that they keep their streak alive in the app. So yeah, you get people to really care about their engagement in the app. And in this case, also learning a language. I think it's a really interesting combination. And again, I think just one example of like an app that's kind of like, I think it's a good one to watch because I seem to be at the cutting edge of some of these strategies. Um, and then, it's interesting how they monetize it there too, because as I mentioned, I think they've released a higher tier subscription. So they almost have these different levels where for some of these features, like, their in-app kind of game style, like their AI powered video calls, those are going to be at the higher subscription tier. So for those users who are really engaged with the app there.
Yeah, Duolingo is, of course, a fascinating example. I wouldn't say that it teaches you a language. It does teach you a few different words, but let's be honest, nobody has learned a language through Duolingo.
Yeah, so maybe we're talking about it all wrong. Maybe it is just a game for people, and like
It's,
that's why
I
this.
would say it's way more of a game. It's way more
Yeah.
of a game, and it gives you that perspective of like, well, I'm not just playing Candy Crush. It's the same thing as saying like, a puzzle game will
Oh,
increase your IQ because you're
yeah.
solving so many puzzles.
Oh yeah, I remember those, and like yeah, those games like Brain Test and like Brain IQ
Yeah.
back in the day. Yeah, those
Yeah, the
those were
same
good
thing.
ones.
Like Candy Crush won't increase that. You can tell yourself that it'll increase your IQ, but no, you're just solving puzzles and having fun. Same thing, I think, with Duolingo. It doesn't increase your ability to learn languages, but you're having fun. You're feeling that you're benefiting from it. So I find that fascinating, and I find it really not even fascinating. I find the graph like this extremely positive for the games people. I don't know the industry per se, but the games people, because a lot of people have been joining these app companies and helping them to gamify. And by gamifying, I mean adding progression mechanics, adding monetization mechanics, really looking at customer journeys and player journeys and adding those engagement mechanics that make these apps more stickier, better monetizing. And so if games people are getting jobs that are related to games, even though it's outside directly of games, I think that's a very positive thing. So
Totally.
good for apps to grow.
Yep, and we're starting to, I mean, I think kind of to that point, like the line can kind of blur. We're seeing games, for a while, non-games have been learning from gaming. We're seeing games even start to learn from non-games too. And so you're kind of getting that where the industries are able to actually kind of learn from each other. That actually brought to mind one area that we're seeing huge growth on the non-game side is these short drama apps. So I know you're familiar with some of them, like Drama Box, Real Short, Short Max. And so each of those was in the top 15 by year over year revenue growth in 2024. So really among non-games, which is really impressive considering we've talked about how much non-gaming is growing. So all the top players are growing, and even still three of these, smaller, newer apps were able to achieve just huge growth with these, short dramas. And one of them, Real Short, I think is a good one to call out because that's one where Sensor Tower uniquely classifies it as both a game and a non-game because they have like this interactive story game component inside the app as well as that short drama. So we classify it as streaming and we classify it as a game. And so talking about some of the lines being blurred, or even like talking about Duolingo kind of having like the game is kind of like a game for people. I think that is something we're going to continue to see where the lines might blur a little bit in terms of what these are. And I think that means that gaming will continue to try to look to non-games as well to see what they're doing. I think it's going to be more relevant as we move forward compared to, where it was 10 years ago.
maybe I'm just old, but it feels like I'd be more motivated to work on a game that has a positive effect. Like, no offense on White Knight Survival or whatnot. Like I don't think people are having a positive effect. But then again, you go to Duolingo, maybe you don't learn a new language, but you will learn a lot of words and you will have a good streak of mini learning. I think it's good for your brain. There's a lot of positivity that comes through investing time and money in that app versus others. And so when those lines blur, it gives game developers, game professionals, opportunity to work on gaming or games that also do something positive.
For sure. I mean, honestly, like, yeah, for personally speaking, those are the type of games I'm looking
Yeah.
for, right? For me, there's a time and a place for like the kind of like the mindless games too, where, you're on an airplane or something and you just want something to pass the time. But yeah, I mean, that's like, personally speaking, that's what I'm looking for.
Especially if it makes good business. So
For sure.
I mean, Duolingo is like what, $9 billion company by now. Anyway, moving away from Duolingo and just talking a little bit more about apps and games, the average user spends 500 hours annually on mobile. And when you think about this and you think about the different ratios, how can games compete with a bigger slice of this time, given the rise of entertainment and productivity apps and especially social media apps? Like I noticed YouTube for me is the number one thing I open up. Probably for somebody younger, it's TikTok, and it's hard to compete against.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I'll say you're not alone with YouTube. I believe that is the top app globally by time spent, and TikTok is number 2, I think. And those are well up there. Like, again, compared to even things like Netflix, like people just spend so much time on those apps. Those, which we classify as social media, just kind of are well ahead of everything else and are really driving the overall time spent. Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. Even to put the number you gave at the beginning in more perspective, we actually that was averaged just over everybody on Earth. So not just iOS and Google Play users. So that number is actually pretty, like, even low. That's just 500 hours for every single person on Earth. Have a smartphone, don't have a smartphone. So really, we were looking at more like 3.5 out for iOS and Google Play users, 3.5 hours a day. So you do the math there, we're looking like close to 1,300 hours per year on mobile. So again, just huge amounts of time being spent. In terms of, this is actually an interesting topic too, because, sometimes when I do this report, I have a good sense generally of a lot of the trends. They're kind of in line with what we're expecting as we monitor trends over the years. This was one that actually surprised me a little bit, was that we did see times, while we saw time spent climb globally, it was driven largely by certain markets like India. And in the US, it actually declined for the first time ever, just barely. It barely declined, but I still think that's notable given that we've never seen time spent on mobile ever decline before. And we are seeing it level off in, the UK and Japan and some of these other key markets, which, I think fits kind of a trend we've been seeing with, the digital fatigue, I'm going to put in quotes, where people are getting tired a little bit of spending as much time on their phones in certain markets. So in the US, for example, time spent on social media actually did decline year over year, and it declined on streaming and dating too. So some of these, like, these, what you think of as maybe digital first kind of areas, we're seeing declines in time spent for the first time ever. Again, still really high numbers. Like, again, 3.5 hours per day on mobile. People are spending their time on mobile, but I do think it's worth pointing out there. And one thing I checked before, because we don't actually have it in the report, but I checked before the call, was that gaming actually did still climb in terms of time spent in the US. It was like about 3% growth year over year. But I do think that's notable that the digital fatigue has not fully hit gaming yet. So that's, I think, a very good sign for the gaming market, that as people are spending less time streaming, or at least streaming on their phones, they are still playing mobile games. But still, I think, some lessons we can kind of learn from time spent leveling out a bit is that, but as we're seeing that, as we have been discussing, revenue for non-games is still, soaring, including in markets like the US. Like, people are still spending money on social media. They're spending money on streaming. They're spending money on dating. So all these areas where people are spending less time, they're still spending more money. And so I think there's been a shift where, with this digital fatigue, people are still happy to use their phones when they're getting high quality value out of it that they're willing to pay for. So maybe the focus shouldn't necessarily be on, can we get this user to spend more time in the app? It's how can we make sure that time's really high quality? and they're getting something out of it. So they're still willing, they're still happy to pay for that service. And I do think that's something we might see on the gaming side a little bit more as well. So again, I think Pokemon Pocket is an example there where you can play the game for, you can open it twice a day and get a lot of value out of it with very little time spent in the game itself. And I think, that's something we've been kind of seeing on the non-gaming side where, again, maybe demanding less of people's time is actually an okay thing as long as they're still really enjoying it and getting a lot of value out of it too.
Do you see when you look at the increase in engagement, do you see the engagement increase in sort of a background apps or active apps, or is there like a difference? Because let's say YouTube as an example, I think it's half and half. I think like when I consider my own YouTube usage and when I see it around, like people might listen to YouTube or there's a podcast going on they don't necessarily watch. It's kind of like on the background. Same thing with Spotify's and Google Meet. It's for people who have background. But like, do you see the difference there?
Yeah, I believe we only capture when it's in the foreground. So, iOS and Google Play have slightly different methodologies for how they capture it, and so that affects how we classify it as well. But I believe it is only in the foreground. So that's why, when we're looking at something like Spotify, we're looking at when you're actually looking at the Spotify app. So if you're just listening to music, that's not being captured. So again, when we're talking about 3.5 hours per day on mobile, that is like actively using the apps, having them open, looking at the screen, that kind of thing. So yeah, again, I think, even perspective how much people are spending on their phones, these are huge numbers we're talking about.
If you look at your screen time reports, it's scary.
Yeah.
You're like, and this is physically impossible. This is not true. There must be an error in the data. And you start going and it's like, oh yeah, the Zoom calls. Oh yeah, of course. And then you start watching how much time you spend on YouTube. Like for me personally, it's pretty crazy, but it's like a TV that is always on the background.
Totally. Yeah. And it's just so easy to just, you have a 15-minute break. You can just hop on, you stay on, watch a couple of videos.
Yeah. Or doing
maybe
chores
an hour's gone. Yeah, exactly.
And so now I've noticed that Spotify is running on the background, but actually the screen is on because it's showing the podcast going. And I think we're just going to be pushing these numbers up. I don't know what time we hit like 25 hours out of the day we're watching.
Yeah, we're going to, once we were reporting that's when you maybe start questioning our data.
That's how it actually counts on iOS. It counts the multi-screen usage because like, I can assure you I've not watched YouTube Kids that much. It's the iPad.
Yeah, they're able to do it per user account. Yeah, that's true.
So that probably is jacking up the number a little bit. But yeah, the apps are ever more engaging. And that is, in many times it's a question for game developers because we're thinking of like, how can we be the number one or the number two on the user's entertainment funnel? And even anecdotally thinking, like, of course, you walk in an airplane, you will see some people streaming, but you see a lot of people playing games because they're not online. But if you walk to a bus stop or any kind of a public transport, then very few is actually playing. Now you see mostly people in social media or streaming something.
Yeah, I think it's true, and it's and again, it's social media. So like one of the things we have in the report is we do break it down across all of the different subgenres, the total time spent on the non-gaming side. And social media just is so far ahead of everyone else. It's, I think it's looking at this like almost 2.4 trillion hours in social media, followed by like 600 billion. So billion, not trillion, in social messaging. And then, if we're looking at like streaming, it's more like 70 billion. So it's just orders of magnitude above everything else. But I do think, again, so much of that is just driven by these big favorites, YouTube, TikTok. And I do think, that's something everyone, games and non-games, in terms of the attention battle, that's who you're kind of battling with because they just take so much of people's user attention.
Yeah, of course. And we always talk about the games need to be more social to retain. Like, what's more social than a social media?
Yeah,
or a messaging app like.
It's like, are you just trying to replicate something that where you're never going to achieve the goal just because that's like actually what it's focused on? Yeah.
Yeah. Talking about, a couple of more things. I wanted to ask you about these substantial concentrated markets. So China, Japan, South Korea, actually in the order of South Korea, Japan, and then finally China. I think China is the most difficult market due to the even governmental obstacles that they've set for games as a whole, let alone
sure.
externally developed games. And actually, let's not even talk about China. But Japan and South Korea, how do localization trends affect these the international developers looking to penetrate these markets? Are there success cases of recent years where somebody has been able to build substantial business in those markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, these top games needing to be successful in some of these markets. And I think it's just pain. I mean, because, they're so specific, right? What is popular in those markets? I think so much comes down to actually understanding the market. So investing more in, whether it's actually having people in those markets to understand the gaming, what players actually want to play, and so they can help advise your strategy there. So, or just investing more in strategy there, because it's just, it's going to be more expensive given the fact that you might need an entirely different strategy than what you use in Western markets. Again, like looking at apps like Brawl Stars that were able to find success across the globe. I think, when you're developing a game, thinking of some of these keeping some of these factors in mind, if you're not going to, change the gameplay, change the art style for these markets, you have to have something that works across markets. And I think Supercell does a good job with that, with, their art style is just kind of generally appealing and will work in those markets. So even in terms of developing the games, I think keeping that global appeal in mind is really important. And then, just also having events tailored to the region. So like the live ops for, those regions and things like that, it will of course take that investment to set all that up and make everything localized, make it actually fit the market. But I do think as we're kind of seeing some of these successes become more global, as competition is going to become more global, that might be what it actually takes to kind of reach the pinnacle on mobile, is you do need to find success in all these markets, and it'll be worth that investment there.
Good that you mentioned the global appeal. So making a game with Vikings might sound really, really cool if you live in the Western Hemisphere. To others, like, what?
You have no idea what that is.
Yeah, well, maybe, but it's just like so not interesting because you're not tied to it at all. The same way as some kind of like a Three Kingdoms type of a game would be very not interesting for us because we just don't know the history and the aspects of it. But you mentioned Supercell, and that's a good mention there because I think they're the biggest publisher in South Korea.
I'd have to check that. Sounds plausible at least.
But they also have a big team in South Korea. So just to be clear, and the localization doesn't mean that I'm going to Asia, I'm going to add dragons and pandas. Like that, of course not. This is global entertainment. World of Warcraft is, or League of Legends or Fortnite, they're all appreciated across the globe. But it's probably more of like, how do you culturalize your marketing? How well your game is localized? What kind of, even on-site events, how do you promote your game inside those markets? How do you communicate to the community? And that's where it comes with having the appeal in key markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are by far and away some of the biggest factors here. And again, it does takes the focus, and then we are seeing that more ways, again, mentioning Supercell, if they're going to be less focused on launching new games, they can maybe devote a little bit more of those resources to localization efforts, to actually making sure that they are able to find success in these new markets. And I do think that's something we are actually observing work for them, and a few other examples as well. And even things like, different monetization strategies, right? Different in-app purchase, methods are going to work in different markets too. So like, you really have to kind of understand these markets and understand what's going to work. And it's not you can't just create one game and expect it to work in all these across the globe. But I do, it's been cool to actually see a little bit more of games finding success in some of these markets, like you mentioned, Japan and Korea specifically, that had been traditionally really hard to break into for, like, I'd say Western publishers generally. And then, I also think as those markets see, we mentioned challenges to like RPGs, I do think that might potentially we might see more potential for things like strategy games to kind of replace some of that market there.
Yeah, and it's also important that developers start looking at, or publishers look at the growing markets. Like traditionally we've seen like Southeast Asia as the number one, but I think MENA is the fastest growing in terms of amount of players. And there's traditionally been seen also as a lot of tier 3 countries, but there's plenty of like tier 1 when you look at the monetization, when you start putting in the UAE, the Qatars, the Saudi Arabias and so forth. I mean, Israel is also in MENA. So those are all high average revenue per paying user numbers that we're seeing in those markets. So
For sure. And yeah, even like you mentioned, for example, in the Middle East, we saw, in-app purchase revenue climbed 18%. So, we're talking
Yeah.
4% globally, 18% in the Middle East. Even like Latin America was up 13% year over year. So some of these smaller markets, still relatively low, even, if they monetize quite well on a per user basis, like in the Middle East. But I do think, those will just continue to grow. So will be areas that become increasingly important, even if as of right now, if we're, US, of the 2.8 billion gained globally last year, US accounted for 2 billion of that. So still by far the largest market, or, Europe accounted for another 1.5 billion. Of course, now you're seeing that adds up to more than the total because that's offset by the $1 billion decline in Asia. But yeah, we're kind of getting a good sense globally of where things are trending. And yeah, there are going to be opportunities outside of, the US and Europe and some of these core
Mm.
markets as well.
So think globally, act locally, focus on key markets, and some of these key markets might be emerging. So make sure to look at the data as well, and don't live in the past of like, it's only Japan and Korea that makes sense. And it's only, whatever the European key countries, the Germany, the UK, the France, but there's a lot of growth pockets if you start breaking down the data. And if you invest into local marketing, a little bit of culturalization, again, not changing the game per se, but changing how you market it, there's gains to be had.
Yeah, I think that's like a perfect summary, and I think that's what we're going to continue to see, and developers being creative with this too. Trying things that might be different than what we've seen historically, just because we don't know where things are going to go, and there might be some opportunities for developers that are going to take some risks and be a little bit more creative too.
Yeah, everything. This is normal in a mature market. This is what fast-moving consumer goods does. Like you should say, sell the same Pringles, but you approach the marketing a little bit differently in different geos. And I think we're moving towards that direction where we need to put a little bit more effort in order to market our billion-dollar franchises. Final thing that I wanted to ask is about the audience. So Gen Z continues to really embrace the user-generated content platforms. So we got the Discourse, the Instagrams, the TikToks, the Snaps. How can game developers other than Roblox tap into this behavior and these preferences? And overall, is there anything that can be done to stop the unstoppable Roblox capturing from every single UGC player? And Roblox and Minecraft, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question because when you were asking it, I was like, the first thing that of course came to my mind was Roblox and Minecraft because Roblox is it's the biggest game in the world by monthly active users, and of course it's also it's the top. We show that for players aged 18 to 24 is by far the top game as well. I believe like 22% of the US users, mobile users, play Roblox, which is pretty wild. It's just a huge number. It ranks up there with a lot of the top non-games. So yeah, just hugely popular. I mean, it's when you talk, it's a good question because it's hard. As you can see with those games, it's hard to do that, right? Same thing with some of the top social media companies. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we might be seeing, and again, this is probably easier said than done, but just the idea of working with social media is also part of your strategy. So for example, again, we mentioned earlier on with Last War, like the fact that those games can be integrated into TikToks, or like you can see videos on TikTok or Instagram of people, like whatever conversations going on in the background and people are playing Minecraft and like the back, you get like the just different kind of simple gameplays that you can see in the background. And then also just the, viral moments, the virality of streamers and things like that too. So even for gaming that don't use user-generated content, if you can kind of leverage the popularity of some of these social media sites, again, a lot easier said than done, you can find success. So, an example I'm thinking of is, there was like a supermarket simulator that was really popular on the web, and it drove this huge growth in a couple of supermarket games on mobile. So just because it went viral on, social media, even outside of mobile gaming, there's, My Supermarket Simulator 3D got more than 80 million downloads in 2024 off of just some viral growth that happened completely outside of, its own environment. So I think that's, again, creating user-generated content is hard unless if you do it like the all-in method, kind of like Roblox and Minecraft do. So we may see more competitors in that space as well, kind of fighting for that attention. But I do think we'll also see maybe game developers keeping track of what trends are popular on social media, because if you can find what younger users are interested in, whether it's supermarket simulators or whatever else it is, that might be able to give you some insights into what gaming trends might also appeal to that same audience. So again, I think more of a general strategy, but it is something that I would continue to monitor, I think, moving forward.
Got it. Well, I think I asked all my questions. I have only one, and that is looking at the report, Sensor Tower, State of the Market, link below. What are some of the things that you would like the readers to focus on? Because there's, as I said, like I think 80 something pages. Like which ones are kind of key takeaways that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, so I may throw in some non-gaming ones as well, because that's a lot of my focus
please.
too.
This is a business podcast.
Yeah, of course. And yes, please, if you go to stateofmobile2025.com, one word, just stateofmobile2025, you can find the report and download it there and follow along any of these trends for yourself. Honestly, a lot probably more engaging to look at all the charts than to just hear me talk about them. But some of the trends, I mentioned digital fatigue earlier. That's going to be one that I think is really interesting to monitor, just because for me, it's entirely new to see time spent actually decline. Another that's interesting on non-gaming side, but I think can kind of cross over to gaming, and what we're seeing is coming out of the pandemic, we are seeing on non-gaming, where we're seeing some of the most success is apps that are able to connect users into the real world rather than just like the digital world. So rather than just like dating apps being the focus, we're seeing health and fitness apps that have you connect with your local running club and actually go out and runs with people, like Strava.
Anti-metaverse apps. Yeah,
exactly. Honestly, yeah, yeah. Or like instead of having food delivery, we're having apps like actual like fast food apps where you go order online and pick up your food, and it improves that process. Or grocery store apps where you can pull up coupons and things like that. So where you're actually, again, going physically in person. So places where app developers are integrating like the mobile app into the actual in-person experience is kind of where we're seeing the most growth right now. Maybe partially because that got stalled during the pandemic. But I do think that was another trend that was particularly interesting to me too.
So digital fatigue and anti-metaverse. I'm just going to call it that. It's easier to understand that way. So anything that has a connection to the physical elements, that will be,
Yeah, and of course, these are general trends. So like there are a lot of apps that are still, digital focused. I'd say metaverse apps are still doing really well. Again, we are seeing revenue climb across the board, but that was something that jumped out to me is like a common theme across like some of the fastest growing. Is again a lot of that connects you to in person, or even just connecting you across devices as well.
And then digital fatigue. I'm fishing. Let's say I'm a game developer. A game API is not looking that hard. We need to do something fast. Hey, I have an idea. Let's make an app that taps into digital fatigue that is seeing as a trend in Sensor Tower report. And I'm going to make an app that gamifies people using less time on their social media apps. Would that be it?
I think possibly. I mean, it's funny because like now you'd have to come up with the right strategy for it. But I'm thinking of for example, you have like these walking reward apps, so Sweatcoin, and there's a couple other Cash Walk. Yeah. So again, not really a game, but it does incentivize you to get out and walk and things like that, and get out into the real world. And those apps are actually also seeing a resurgence. So not exactly what you're talking about, but I think if there's a way to somehow, I haven't, looked that deeply into Pokemon Go's performance and things like that. But, and that's, of course, a game that incentivizes you to get out into the real world. There might be opportunities there if you are creative enough to be able to find a good way to actually connect those things.
That's awesome. I'm going to make that's the app I want to make. There's going to be a streak of how long you have been not watching YouTube. And then you'll mental health points every day.
And then you'll pay for streak repair in that too. You'll pay for the in-app purchase to repair your streak for not using.
And there's going to be a social group like an AA that basically, it's going to give each other encouragement. I've been 14 days off TikTok and it's really hard. My friends are tired. It's like, You can do it. I know it's hard. Every day is a new start.
Honestly, I think you're onto something here. People are focusing on their time spent in apps, right? People are already monitoring that. Why not try to tap into that and give them extra incentives?
Excellent. Then you can share your screen of like really low screen time of like, I've spent 15 minutes last week on Instagram. You can flex it and it posts automatically on Instagram without you going to Instagram.
Exactly. It's like people bragging about their workouts on Strava. It's the same thing. Yeah, I think it works.
Okay.
You're onto something.
Well, thank you. So thank you everybody for listening. Jonathan, you're a market guru. And even in this conversation, there came up a startup idea for an app.
Excellent. Can't promise it every time, but I mean, again, you're the creative genius here.
Yeah. So somebody, if you execute, give Jonathan some shares. Too, because you heard it here on this podcast. If you build an app where you gamify your limited interaction with social media, that's it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Hope this is super useful. There's a link again in the description below where you can get the full report. And Jonathan will be back when the state of gaming will drop sometime soon, right?
Yes, it should be in the next, I believe, a month or two. So should be coming pretty soon, and look forward to diving even deeper into gaming then.
Stay tuned. And meanwhile, ship apps, ship games. We'll catch you later. Bye-bye, everybody.
You did it. You made it to the end of the episode. As a fan of the show, it would help us out if you'd subscribe and leave us a review on the podcast service of your choice. Those stars and likes, while a small action on your part, mean a lot to us and help to grow the show. More importantly, are you a member of the Deconstructor of Fun Slack group? If you have 5 years or more of games industry experience, go to deconstructoroffun.com/Slack and apply to join. Join the games industry best professional community filled with peers always willing to lend a hand, or subscribe to our newsletter to get all the latest insights from the Deconstructor of Fun content creators. Thanks for listening.